The year is 1227, and in the shadow of the Liupan Mountains, beneath the vast expanse of an indifferent sky, an empire holds its breath. Genghis Khan, the man who unified the steppes, who commanded the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known, lies dying in his campaign tent. His generals gather close, their weathered faces illuminated by the flickering lamplight that casts long, dancing shadows across the felt walls. They know what comes next: succession, division, perhaps the slow unraveling of everything they have built together through blood and steel and unwavering determination. The air is thick with incense and the smell of medicines, of herbs gathered from across the empire, remedies that have failed to stem the fever consuming their leader. Outside, the camp is silent, thousands of warriors waiting in the darkness, waiting for news that will change the world. But in this timeline, in this quiet alternate stream of history that branches away from everything we know, something impossible happens. The fever breaks. His breathing, which had grown shallow and ragged, steadies into a deep, regular rhythm. His eyes open, dark and alert, filled with that same terrible clarity that once transformed scattered tribes into an unstoppable force that reshaped continents. He does not die, and the world, unknowingly, turns toward a future it was never meant to see. In the stillness of that tent, as dawn breaks over the mountains and light spills across the plateau, Genghis Khan rises from his bed, and time itself seems to pause, uncertain of the path ahead, uncertain of what it means when history's great conqueror refuses to release his grip on life. What happens when a conqueror, a unifier, a destroyer and creator, is given not decades, but centuries? What happens when the Khan who rode from Mongolia to the gates of Europe simply continues riding, through ages yet unborn, through empires yet unimagined, through transformations that would seem like magic to the warrior he once was? This is not the story of his death. This is the story of what comes after, when death never comes at all. The first century is perhaps the strangest, the most disorienting. He is 65 when he should have died, but now he is 66, then 70, then 80, and still his body does not fail him. His joints do not ache. His vision does not dim. His strength remains undiminished, as if some invisible force has frozen him in time, preserving him at the moment when death should have claimed him. His sons, Ojide, Chagatai, Tului, watch their father with a mixture of reverence and unease that grows deeper with each passing year. They were prepared to divide the empire, to rule as Khans in their own right, to carry forward his legacy while carving out their own destinies. But how can one succeed a man who will not leave? How can one inherit power from someone who simply continues, year after year, defying the natural order that governs all living things? Genghis Khan himself feels the weight of this impossibility pressing down on him. He remembers the steps of his childhood with perfect clarity, remembers being Temujin, the boy whose father was poisoned by Tartars, who was abandoned by his tribe in the harsh wilderness, who clawed his way from nothing to become the ruler of the world. Those memories do not fade with time. Instead, they grow sharper, more vivid, as if time is engraving them deeper into his consciousness with each passing year. He returns to Karakoram, the capital his son would have expanded in another timeline, and he watches as the empire consolidates its vast holdings. The Silk Road flourishes under Mongol protection, becoming safer and more prosperous than it has been in centuries. Merchants travel freely from Venice to Beijing without fear of bandits or arbitrary taxes, protected by the Yasa and the Khan's decree. The Yasa itself, his code of laws, spreads across continents, bringing order to chaos, unity to fragmentation. And he begins to understand something fundamental about power and time. Conquest is finite, but governance is eternal. The work of building lasts far longer than the work of destroying. In 1241, when the Mongol armies would have withdrawn from Europe after Ojibde's death in our timeline, they do not. Because Ojibde does not ascend to become Great Khan. Because Genghis Khan still rules, still commands, still directs the vast military machine he created. And so the Golden Horde does not splinter into warring factions. The campaign into Hungary, into Poland, into the very heart of Christendom, continues, pushing deeper into territories that in our timeline were spared the Mongol advance. By 1260, he is 98 years old by count of years, and whispers spread across the empire like wind through grass. The Eternal Khan, they call him, voices dropping to reverent whispers. Tingri's chosen, blessed with unending life by the eternal blue sky. Religious scholars from every faith, Buddhist monks in saffron robes, Muslim imams with knowledge of the Quran, Christian priests carrying crosses, Taoist sages from the mountains of China, are summoned to Karakoram to explain this miracle, this curse, this impossible continuation of life beyond its natural span. He listens to them all with the same patient intensity he once used to study enemy formations before battle, the same careful attention he brought to understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those he would conquer. But he finds no answers in their theories and prayers, only speculation, only wonder, only the same confusion he himself feels when he looks in a mirror and sees a face that has not aged in decades. He watches his sons grow old, and this is perhaps the hardest part of his immortality. Ojibde, once strong and capable, a worthy heir who might have ruled well, becomes frail with passing years, his hair turning white, his movements growing slow and careful. He dies in 1241, not as a great Khan who ruled in his own right, but as a prince who spent his entire life in his father's shadow, waiting for a throne that never emptied. Chagatai follows in 1262, bitter and frustrated, his ambitions unfulfilled. Tului's sons, Monkey and Kublai, brilliant commanders and administrators in their own right, look to their grandfather with expressions that mix hope and resentment and something like fear. They are capable, visionary, worthy of greatness, but they remain forever subordinate, waiting for a succession that never comes, aging while their grandfather remains unchanged. Genghis Khan begins to change his approach to governance, realizing that an immortal ruler cannot govern the same way a mortal one does. He decentralizes power, creates a system of rotating governors and regional administrators, establishes councils that can function without his direct oversight. He travels constantly, never staying in one place for too long, moving from the steppes of Mongolia to the palaces of Samarkand, from the rice fields of China to the forests of Russia, from the deserts of Persia to the cities of Eastern Europe. He becomes not just a conqueror, not just a ruler, but a presence, a living symbol of unity that holds the empire together through sheer continuity, through the fact of his existence across decades that turn into generations. The 13th century fades into the 14th, and the world transforms around him in ways both subtle and profound. Kublai Khan, his grandson who in our timeline became the Emperor of China and established the Yuan dynasty, never achieves that particular glory, because Genghis Khan himself takes that role, claiming the mandate of heaven in a ceremony that blends Mongol tradition with Chinese ritual. In 1207-9, the Song dynasty falls, just as it did in our timeline, crushed by superior Mongol military force and relentless campaigning. But it falls to the eternal Khan, the man who has lived long enough to see the fruits of seeds he planted 50 years before finally ripen into conquest. He sits in the Forbidden City, in halls built for Chinese emperors, surrounded by luxury and ceremony that would have seemed absurd to the young warrior who once lived in felt tents and ate mare's milk and meat cooked over dung fires on the open steppe. And he understands the irony, feels the weight of transformation pressing down on him. He, who once lived the simple life of a nomad, who valued horses and bows above all else, now presides over the most sophisticated bureaucracy on earth, managing millions of people through layers of administration that would have baffled him in his youth. He learns to read and write Chinese, spending long hours with tutors, studying the classical texts of Confucius and Mencius and Laozi. He debates with scholars about the mandate of heaven, about the proper relationship between ruler and ruled, about the nature of virtue and power. And slowly, almost imperceptibly to those around him but crystal clear in his own awareness, he begins to evolve beyond the man he was. The warrior who once ordered the massacre of entire cities, who built pyramids of skulls as warnings to those who would resist his rule, who believed that terror was the most effective tool of conquest, now seeks different forms of power, more subtle and lasting. He establishes universities in every major city of the empire, centers of learning that draw scholars from across the known world. He commissions the translation of texts from Arabic, Persian, Sanskrit, Greek, preserving knowledge that might otherwise be lost. He creates a postal system that spans from Korea to Hungary, a vast network of roads and way stations and relay horses that makes the Roman cursus publicus look provincial by comparison. Messages can travel from one end of the empire to the other in weeks rather than months. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace that historians in our timeline mark as a brief golden age of trade and cultural exchange, deepens and extends far beyond its historical span. Trade flourishes across continents. Ideas flow freely along protected routes. A merchant in Cairo can do business with a merchant in Hangzhou using the same currency, protected by the same laws, confident that contracts will be enforced and disputes resolved fairly. And at the center of it all, holding it together like the hub of a vast wheel, an old man who does not age, who remembers every battle, every betrayal, every triumph, who carries within him the entire history of the empire he created. 1348. The Black Death emerges from the steppes of Central Asia, a pestilence that will reshape the world, spreading along those same trade routes the Mongols protected and maintained with such care. In our timeline, it killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, devastated the Islamic world, weakened the Mongol successor states that had fragmented after the empire's dissolution. But in this timeline, where the empire remains unified under the eternal Khan, the response is immediate and ruthless. Genghis Khan, who has ruled for 121 years, who has seen famines and epidemics before, recognizes the threat instantly when reports begin arriving from the western provinces. Entire regions are quarantined, borders sealed by military force. Trade routes are severed at strategic points, then carefully redirected to isolate infected areas. Cities showing signs of plague are surrounded by armed soldiers, their inhabitants forbidden to leave on pain of immediate execution. Food and water are provided, but no one enters or exits until the disease has run its course. It is brutal, uncompromising, the kind of decisive action that only an absolute ruler with centuries of experience can implement without hesitation or doubt. And it works, though not perfectly, though not without terrible cost. The plague still spreads, still kills millions across the empire, leaving cities half empty and fields untended and families shattered. But the empire survives intact, its institutions functioning, its trade networks eventually restored, its administrative machinery continuing to operate even in the face of catastrophe. He loses people he has known for decades, for what feels like lifetimes in his strange extended existence. Advisors he has worked with for 30 years succumb to fever. Generals who fought beside him in campaigns long past die choking on their own blood. Administrators who helped build the empire's bureaucracy are buried in mass graves. They age and die while he remains, unchanging, untouched by the disease that ravages everyone around him. He begins to keep journals during this period, writing in Mongolian, in Chinese, in Persian, recording not just events but thoughts, observations, the strange internal landscape of immortality. What is it like, he writes, to watch the world change while you stay the same? What is it like to outlive your children, your grandchildren, your great-great-grandchildren, to see faces age and fade while your own remains frozen? He writes about the loneliness that grows like a slow disease, about the distance that opens between himself and the rest of humanity. He is their Khan, their emperor, their eternal ruler, but he is also something else now, something other, something that cannot quite connect to the ordinary rhythms of human life anymore. The 14th century turns to the 15th, and Europe begins its renaissance, a flowering of art and thought and learning. Ideas from the Islamic Golden Age, carefully preserved and transmitted through Mongol territories, flow westward into Italy and beyond. The printing press is invented by Gutenberg, and Genghis Khan immediately recognizes its significance in a way that many of his contemporaries do not. He orders texts to be printed in every language of the empire: Mongolian, Chinese, Arabic, Persian, Russian, Hungarian, creating a network of knowledge that spans continents and languages and cultures. 1453. Constantinople, the great city that has stood for over 1,000 years as the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, faces its final siege in our timeline, falling to the Ottoman Turks under Mehmed II, marking the end of Byzantium and the beginning of a new era in Mediterranean history. But in this timeline, the political landscape is fundamentally different. The Ottomans are not the dominant power in the Near East. The Mongol Empire, still unified under the Eternal Khan, still controls Anatolia, Persia, the Caucasus, the vast territories that in our timeline fragmented into competing khanates. When Mehmed II masses his armies before the great Theodosian walls, when his cannons begin to pound the ancient fortifications that have protected the city for a millennium, he finds not a weak and dying Byzantine state struggling in isolation, but Mongol reinforcements arriving by land and sea, cavalry pouring down from the north, ships carrying troops and supplies through the Bosphorus. The city does not fall. Instead, after months of siege and negotiation and careful diplomacy, it becomes a Mongol protectorate, a cosmopolitan center where East and West merge even more dramatically than they did historically, where Orthodox Christians and Muslims and Buddhists trade and argue and intermarry under the protection of Mongol law. Genghis Khan visits Constantinople that year, entering through the Golden Gate as emperors once did, walking through the Hagia Sophia with its soaring dome and glittering mosaics. He is now 288 years old by the count of years since his birth, though his body remains unchanged from the moment he should have died. He has seen empires rise and fall, religions spread and transform, technologies emerge that would have seemed like magic or divine intervention to the young warrior on the steppes. He thinks often during these years of his early life, memories that grow more precious as they recede further into the past. Of his father Yesugei, a minor chieftain poisoned by Tartars, his death leaving young Temujin and his family vulnerable and alone. Of his wife Bort, kidnapped by the Merkits in the early days, rescued through his first great military campaign, a desperate raid that forged his reputation as a war leader. Of Jamuka, his blood brother who became his rival, who fought against him for supremacy over the steppes, who he eventually defeated and executed according to the laws of their people. These memories are often more real to him than the present, more vivid than the faces of his current advisors and generals and administrators. The faces of the long dead appear more clearly in his mind than the living who surround him. He has outlived the Mongol tradition of sky burial, has seen Buddhism take deep root in Mongolia itself, has watched Islam spread across the western provinces of his empire, has seen Christianity splinter into Orthodox and Catholic and eventually Protestant. And he has made a conscious, deliberate decision that guides his policy for centuries. No single religion will dominate the empire. The state will remain pluralistic, tolerant, pragmatic in matters of faith. It is not idealism that drives this policy, not some enlightened vision of religious freedom as later ages would understand it. It is pure survival, the recognition that an empire this vast, encompassing this many peoples and cultures and beliefs, cannot be held together by religious uniformity. Diversity, properly managed, is strength. Unity comes not from sameness but from shared law and mutual benefit. The 16th century arrives, and with it comes an age of exploration that will reshape the world's geography and power structures. European powers, Portugal, Spain, England, France, begin to sail around Africa, across the Atlantic Ocean into unknown waters, seeking new routes to Asia that bypass the Mongol-controlled Silk Road and its tolls and regulations. They are driven by commerce and curiosity and religious zeal, by the desire for spices and gold and new territories to claim and convert. But they find that the Mongol Empire has also taken to the seas, adapting once again to changing times. Chinese junks, massive ships built with techniques perfected over centuries, sail under the banner of the Eternal Khan, carrying goods and soldiers and administrators across the Indian Ocean. Mongol fleets patrol the sea lanes from Hormuz to Malacca, ensuring safe passage for merchants who pay the required fees, interdicting pirates and smugglers. When Portuguese ships round the Cape of Good Hope, when they arrive in the Indian Ocean expecting to find weak, divided Asian kingdoms ripe for conquest and exploitation, they encounter instead a unified maritime network backed by the largest land empire in history. Diplomatic relations are established, treaties negotiated, spheres of influence carefully delineated to avoid open war. Genghis Khan is now 350 years old, a span of time that defies comprehension, that places him beyond any normal human frame of reference. He has learned Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, adding them to his growing collection of languages. He reads the works of Renaissance thinkers, Machiavelli's treatises on power, More's visions of utopia, Erasmus's critiques of church corruption. He debates with Jesuit missionaries about the nature of God and power and truth, listening carefully to their arguments, responding with observations drawn from 3 centuries of experience governing millions of people across multiple continents. He authorizes the establishment of a permanent Mongol embassy in Rome, another in Lisbon, another in Seville, creating formal diplomatic channels that in our timeline would not exist for centuries. And Europe, which in our timeline dominated the age of exploration and colonization, instead finds itself negotiating with an empire that spans 3 continents and shows no signs of decline or fragmentation. The Americas are discovered by Columbus in 1492, just as in our timeline, but colonization proceeds very differently in the presence of Mongol interest. Mongol expeditions join European ones, ships carrying warriors and administrators and merchants across the Atlantic. The diseases still spread, the devastating plagues that will kill 90% of indigenous populations. That horror unfolds regardless of which empires are involved. But the political landscape shifts dramatically. Instead of purely European colonies, there are mixed settlements, Mongol-European trading posts, a more complex web of power and influence and competing interests. The Aztec Empire falls in 1521, the Inca Empire in 1533, but not to Spanish conquistadors alone. Mongol observers are present, recording, learning, advising, sometimes intervening. The great civilizations of the Americas encounter not just European technology and disease, but the full weight of Eurasian imperial power, centuries of accumulated knowledge about conquest and administration and the management of diverse populations. 1608–9. The Enlightenment is beginning in Europe, a flowering of reason, science, individual liberty, skepticism toward traditional authority. And Genghis Khan, now 462 years old, having lived through the entire Renaissance and the Reformation and the wars of religion that tore Europe apart, watches this new development with fascination and careful attention. He invites European philosophers to Karakoram, which has grown over the centuries into a vast metropolis, a city of libraries and observatories and academies, where scholars from every corner of the empire gather to study and debate and teach. The city that began as a tent encampment in the wilderness of Mongolia has become one of the great intellectual centers of the world. He reads Descartes and his meditations on certainty and doubt, Locke and his theories of government deriving from the consent of the governed, Spinoza and his radical reimagining of God and nature as a single substance. He commissions translations of their works into Chinese, Persian, Arabic, Mongolian, ensuring that these ideas circulate throughout the empire. He writes commentaries on their arguments, drawing connections to Confucian thought, to Buddhist philosophy, to Islamic theology, creating syntheses that blend Eastern and Western traditions in ways that fascinate scholars. Some European visitors begin to wonder privately if the Eternal Khan is truly a single individual or rather a symbol, a title passed down through generations with each successive ruler carefully trained to maintain the same persona, to perpetuate the same myths of immortality and continuity. It seems more plausible than the alternative, more rational than accepting that a single human being could live for over 4 centuries without aging. But those who actually meet him, who speak with him at length, who hear him recount events from centuries past with perfect clarity and intimate detail that no historian could possibly know, who recognize in his bearing and manner something genuinely ancient, they know the truth. And it terrifies them, and awes them, and makes them question everything they thought they understood about the nature of reality and human existence. The Mongol Empire has evolved profoundly over these centuries. It is no longer purely nomadic, though the steppes remain important culturally and spiritually. It is no longer purely conquest-driven, though military power remains the foundation of its security. It has become a hybrid civilization, a fusion that incorporates Chinese bureaucracy with its examinations and meritocracy, Persian culture with its poetry and art, Islamic scholarship with its emphasis on learning and law, European technology with its innovations in metallurgy and navigation and printing. It has universities in Baghdad and Beijing, in Moscow and Delhi and Samarkand, institutions that rival and sometimes surpass the great universities of Europe. It has a legal code that has evolved far beyond the original Yasa, now blending traditional Mongol concepts with ideas of natural law and rights imported from Western philosophy. And at its center, unchanging, eternal, a fixed point in a turning world, a man who remembers when everything was simpler, when power came directly from horses and bows and the unity of the steppes, when conquest meant riding into battle rather than managing trade agreements and diplomatic negotiations. He misses it sometimes, that simplicity, that directness, the clarity of purpose that came from being a warrior among warriors. Misses the feel of wind on the grasslands, the taste of fermented mare's milk, the songs of his people under the stars, the campfires and the stories and the bonds forged through shared hardship. But he cannot go back to that world. It is gone, as thoroughly gone as his youth, as his mortality, as the people he loved in those distant days. He can only move forward, century after century, an immortal anachronism trying to guide an empire through ages he was never meant to see, adapting constantly, evolving constantly, becoming something new while carrying within him all that he was. 1776. The American colonies declare their independence from Britain, and the world watches as a new kind of nation is born, one founded explicitly on Enlightenment principles, on democracy and representation, on the radical idea that government derives its legitimate power from the consent of the governed rather than from divine right or ancestral claim or the simple fact of conquest. Genghis Khan reads the Declaration of Independence with a mixture of admiration and skepticism that comes from seeing countless forms of government rise and fall over the centuries. He, who built an empire through conquest and held it through fear and law and the force of his personality and presence, what can he possibly make of this experiment in self-governance, this attempt to create a system where power flows upward from the people rather than downward from a monarch? And yet, he adapts, as he has always adapted, as he must adapt to survive across centuries. In the late 18th century, he begins to implement gradual reforms throughout the empire. Regional assemblies are established in major provinces, advisory councils with representatives elected by various constituencies, merchants, landowners, scholars, military officers. It is not democracy in the American sense, not truly government by the people. The eternal Khan still rules, his word still carries the force of law, final authority still rests with him alone. But it is a loosening, a recognition that an empire this vast, this diverse, encompassing this many different peoples and cultures and traditions, cannot be held together solely by the will of one man alone, even if that man is immortal and has ruled for over 5 centuries. The Industrial Revolution begins in Britain in the mid-18th century, and the Mongol Empire industrializes alongside Europe, drawing on its vast resources and its long tradition of adapting foreign technologies. Coal mines in Siberia produce fuel for steam engines. Textile factories in Persia employ thousands of workers. Steel mills in Mongolia itself, in the heartland of the empire, transform the grasslands with smoke and fire and the clang of machinery. The empire that was built on horseback, that conquered through mobility and superior tactics and the composite bow, now runs on steam and steel and coal, on railways and telegraphs and factory production. Railroads stretch from Moscow to Beijing, iron tracks cutting across thousands of miles of steppe and desert and mountain, connecting cities that once took months to travel between, reducing journey times to days or weeks. From Istanbul to Delhi, from Samarkand to Karakoram, the empire is stitched together by rails and locomotives and the steady rhythm of industrial progress. The world is shrinking, connecting, transforming at an accelerating pace, and Genghis Khan, now 649 years old, feels the acceleration of history like a physical force pressing against him. He has lived through centuries of slow change, where a generation felt like an eternity, where the world of one's childhood remained largely unchanged into old age. But now, decades pass in what feels like moments. Technologies emerge and become obsolete within a single lifetime. Ideas spread at the speed of print, then at the speed of telegraph messages crackling across copper wires. The world is racing towards something, some destination or transformation that even he, with all his accumulated experience and wisdom, cannot quite predict or fully understand. 1814. Napoleon is defeated at Waterloo, exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, and the European powers gather at the Congress of Vienna to redraw the map of the continent, to restore the old order that the French Revolution and Napoleon's conquests had shattered. But that map has always been complicated by the presence of the Mongol Empire, which controls everything from Poland to Korea, from Siberia to the Arabian Peninsula, an enormous territory that dwarfs any European state and makes nonsense of their attempts to create a stable balance of power. The Europeans cannot ignore the empire, cannot simply wish it away or pretend it doesn't exist. They cannot contain it through alliances or military force. They can only negotiate with it, accommodate its interests, recognize its power and permanence. Genghis Khan sends emissaries to Vienna, skilled diplomats who speak perfect French and German and English, who understand European politics and history, as well as any Habsburg or Bourbon courtier, who can navigate the complex social hierarchies and unwritten rules of European aristocracy. The empire is no longer alien to European eyes, no longer purely exotic or other. It is simply a fact of global politics, a superpower that has existed for 6 centuries and shows no signs of fading or fragmenting or declining into irrelevance. He himself rarely appears in public during these years. He has learned through long experience that mystery serves immortality better than constant presence, that absence can enhance authority, that becoming partially mythical while still living serves his purposes. Let the people wonder about the eternal Khan. Let them tell stories, elaborate myths, create legends that grow with each retelling. Let him become a figure of mystery and power, glimpsed occasionally, but never quite fully known or understood. But in private, in his chambers in whatever palace he currently occupies, in Karakoram, in Beijing, in Samarkand, in Moscow, he continues to read voraciously, to write extensively, to think deeply about the nature of power and time and human civilization. He has outlived the Mongol culture he was born into by centuries now. The language has evolved so dramatically that modern Mongolian would be almost incomprehensible to the warriors who fought beside him in the 13th century. The customs have changed beyond recognition, adapted and transformed through centuries of interaction with Chinese, Persian, Russian, European influences. The very identity of what it means to be Mongol has been remade again and again, until the connection to those early days on the steppes is more symbolic than real. And yet, he remains the last true link to that vanished world, the only person alive who actually remembers the unification of the tribes, who knew Temujin before he became Genghis Khan, who was there at the beginning of everything that followed. He thinks often during these quiet years about what he has lost through his impossible longevity. His first wife, Bort, who he loved with a fierce devotion that never diminished, dead 700 years now, her face still clear in his memory though her voice has faded to a whisper he can barely recall. His sons, all gone centuries ago, buried with honors but never quite achieving their full potential, forever overshadowed by his continuing presence. His companions from the early days, the warriors who fought beside him in the unification wars, who shared his hardships and triumphs, all dust and memory now, all vanished into the past that only he still carries forward. He is surrounded constantly by people, by advisors and servants and scholars and generals and administrators, by the constant bustle and noise of palace life and imperial governance. But he is utterly alone in his continuity, isolated by the simple fact that everyone he has ever known has died while he endures. 1861. The American Civil War begins, tearing apart the young republic that declared its independence less than a century before, pitting North against South in a conflict over slavery and states' rights and the very nature of the Union. Across the ocean, the Mongol Empire watches with interest but does not intervene. Genghis Khan, now 754 years old, observes the conflict with the detachment of someone who has seen 1,000 wars, who understands that some conflicts must burn themselves out, that external intervention often makes things worse rather than better. Slavery has never taken hold in Mongol territories in the way it did in the Americas, not because of moral enlightenment or ethical superiority, but because the Yasa forbade the enslavement of conquered peoples under certain conditions, and because the empire's economy ran on tribute and taxation rather than plantation agriculture. Serfdom exists in various forms throughout the empire, labor systems that bind peasants to land and lords, but chattel slavery of the kind that developed in the Americas never became central to Mongol economic structures. He knows how this war will end. He has learned over centuries to read the trajectories of history, to see the inevitable outcomes long before they arrive, to recognize which side has the resources and population and industrial base to eventually prevail. The North will win, though it will take 4 years and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. Slavery will be abolished, though its legacy will poison American society for generations afterward. And the United States will emerge from the conflict transformed, no longer a loose confederation of states but a unified nation with a powerful federal government. The Mongol Empire itself has changed profoundly in recent decades. Steam-powered ships patrol its extensive coastlines and river systems. Telegraph lines connect its major cities, allowing messages to travel in minutes across distances that once took weeks or months. Railroads carry goods and people across the vast distances that had always been the empire's greatest challenge and greatest strength, turning space from an obstacle into an asset. The empire has adopted a constitution in 1848, after years of debate and negotiation, a document that balances the authority of the eternal Khan with the rights of subjects and the autonomy of regional governments. It is a strange hybrid, unlike anything that exists elsewhere in the world, autocracy tempered by law and representative institutions, unity maintained through diversity rather than imposed uniformity, central authority coexisting with local governance. And it works, somehow, though not perfectly, though never without tensions and conflicts and periodic crises. But it endures, as the empire endures, held together by institutions and laws and shared history and economic integration, and the symbolic presence at its center of a ruler who has been there literally from the beginning. He has survived assassination attempts over the centuries, dozens of them, from poisoned food to hidden blades to ambushes to elaborate conspiracies. He has faced rebellions, civil wars, famines that killed millions, plagues that decimated provinces. He has seen technological revolutions that transformed how people live and work, social transformations that overturned traditional hierarchies, the rise and fall of ideologies and belief systems and entire ways of understanding the world. And through it all, he has remained fundamentally himself. Temujin, who became Genghis Khan, who became the Eternal Khan, who became something neither fully human nor fully myth, but somehow both at once. In his private journals, which now fill entire libraries, rooms full of leather-bound volumes written in his own hand across centuries in multiple languages, he writes extensively about the burden of memory. Every face he has ever seen, every conversation he has ever had, every decision he has ever made, every mistake and triumph and moment of doubt, they accumulate, layer upon layer upon layer, until the past feels heavier than the present, until memory becomes a weight that presses down on consciousness and makes it harder and harder to live fully in the moment. 1914. The Great War begins in Europe, triggered by the assassination of an Austrian archduke but rooted in decades of rising tensions, competing alliances, arms races, imperial rivalries. And the world tears itself apart with machine guns and artillery and poison gas, with technologies of death that would have seemed like nightmares to previous generations, with a scale of killing that dwarfs anything in previous history. The Mongol Empire, stretching across Eurasia from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, touching both sides of the conflict, cannot remain neutral. It is too vast, too interconnected, too central to global politics and economics to simply stand aside and watch. But Genghis Khan, now 807 years old, has learned the hard lessons of history. He has seen countless wars, has fought in hundreds of battles, has ordered attacks and planned campaigns and watched young men die for causes that seemed vital at the time, but meaningless from the perspective of centuries. He does not seek conquest anymore. That hunger has long since faded, replaced by a desire for stability, for preservation, for protecting what has been built rather than expanding endlessly outward. Mongol forces deploy as peacekeepers along the empire's western borders, securing frontiers, preventing the war from spreading eastward into Mongol territories, maintaining order in regions that might otherwise descend into chaos. The empire becomes a mediator, offering neutral ground where exhausted belligerents can meet and negotiate, providing diplomatic channels that might lead toward peace. When the war finally ends in 1918, after 4 years of unprecedented slaughter that killed millions and shattered empires and redrew the map of Europe, it ends in part because the Eternal Khan has offered a framework for peace, a proposal that draws on centuries of experience managing diverse populations and competing interests. That provides face-saving compromises and territorial arrangements that no single European power could have proposed without appearing to favor one side over another. He is 857 years old now, and he has lived longer than any empire in human history. Longer than Rome, which lasted perhaps 5 centuries if you count generously. Longer than Byzantium, which endured for a millennium. Longer than any Chinese dynasty. He has outlasted everything except perhaps the Catholic Church, and even that institution has transformed beyond recognition during his lifetime. And he is tired, though not in any physical sense. His body remains as it was when he should have died at 65, unchanged, unchanging, frozen in time. But mentally, spiritually, emotionally, the weight of centuries presses down on him with crushing force. The accumulation of experiences, memories, losses, transformations, it creates a kind of exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure. He begins to delegate more authority, to withdraw gradually from day-to-day governance. A council of ministers handles most routine decisions, meeting regularly to address the ordinary business of running a vast empire. Regional governors manage their territories with considerable autonomy, reporting to the center but making their own decisions about local matters. The empire's bureaucracy has grown so sophisticated, its institutions so well established, its procedures so codified, that it functions increasingly well without direct intervention from the Khan himself. And he wonders sometimes, in his private moments, if perhaps this was always the goal, always the necessary evolution. To build something that could survive even immortality, something that did not depend on any single individual no matter how long they lived, something that could continue functioning even if he simply walked away into the steppes and never returned. 1945. The world has just emerged from the most destructive war in human history, a global conflict that killed tens of millions, that saw entire cities reduced to rubble by bombing campaigns, that ended with the use of atomic weapons against Japan, demonstrating for the first time that humanity has gained the power to destroy civilization itself. Genghis Khan, who has lived through 938 years, who has seen every form of warfare from mounted archery to mechanized tank divisions, who has witnessed the Black Death and the 100 Years' War and the 30 Years' War and countless other conflicts, now faces a new kind of uncertainty that unsettles him more deeply than anything in centuries. The atomic age. The possibility of total annihilation. He meets with scientists from across the empire, physicists who explain to him in careful detail the principles of nuclear fission and fusion, who describe weapons that can level entire cities in seconds, that can poison the earth and air for generations, that can potentially end human civilization if deployed in sufficient numbers. And he recognizes, with the clarity that comes from centuries of accumulated experience and hard-won wisdom, that something fundamental has shifted in human affairs. For the first time in history, for the first time in his impossibly long life, human beings possess the capability to destroy not just armies or cities or empires, but everything. Civilization itself. Perhaps even the species. The Mongol Empire has nuclear capabilities, of course. It would be impossible for a superpower spanning half the globe, controlling vast resources and scientific infrastructure, not to develop atomic weapons once the basic principles are understood. But Genghis Khan refuses to use them, refuses even to threaten their use as a tool of diplomacy or deterrence. The weapons exist, are maintained and guarded carefully, but his policy is clear and absolute. They will never be deployed except in the most extreme circumstance of existential threat to the empire itself. Instead, he proposes something unprecedented in his long experience of statecraft, an international framework, a council of nations dedicated specifically to preventing nuclear war, to managing the terrible new weapons that science has unleashed, to ensuring that the power to destroy civilization is never actually exercised. It is not entirely successful. The Cold War still emerges, tensions still simmer between the Mongol Empire and other nuclear powers, proxy conflicts still flare in various regions. But the framework exists, providing channels for communication, creating mechanisms for crisis management, establishing norms and protocols that reduce the likelihood of miscalculation or accident. He appears publicly for the first time in many decades at the founding conference of this nuclear council, held in Karakoram in 1946, and the world is genuinely shocked by what they see. The Eternal Khan, who most people have assumed for generations was merely a title passed down through successive rulers, is revealed to be exactly what legend claimed, a single individual who has lived for over 9 centuries, who appears to be in his 60s but speaks with perfect recall about events from the 13th century, who remembers the world before gunpowder, who has witnessed the entire span of modern history. Journalists attempt to interview him, cameras capture his image for broadcast around the world, and people watch in wonder and disbelief as this impossible figure addresses the assembly, speaking about the long view of history, about the patterns he has observed across centuries, about the responsibility that comes with power, about the necessity of preserving civilization for future generations, even when present temptations might suggest otherwise. 1969. Humanity achieves what would have seemed like pure fantasy to any previous generation. We leave the Earth. Astronauts land on the Moon, walking on its surface, looking back at our planet hanging in the void of space like a blue marble suspended against infinite darkness. Genghis Khan watches on television from his palace in Karakoram, and the contrast feels almost unbearable. He thinks about the steppes of his youth, about riding horses across grasslands that seemed infinite, about looking up at the night sky and seeing the moon as something distant and unreachable, a celestial body that moved through its phases but remained forever beyond human grasp. And now, 900 years later, human beings walk on that moon, plant flags on its surface, leave footprints in its dust that will remain undisturbed for millions of years. The Mongol Empire has its own space program, has contributed scientists and engineers and resources to the international efforts that made this achievement possible. But it is a cooperative venture, a joint project involving multiple nations, a symbol of what humanity can accomplish when it works together rather than fighting. The empire he built through conquest and held through force now participates as one power among others in a global system, still influential, still central to many regions, but no longer dominant or unchallengeable. He is 962 years old, and the world has become utterly unrecognizable from the one he was born into. Cities of glass and steel and concrete rise toward the sky, buildings taller than mountains. Computers process information faster than any human mind can follow. Satellites orbit the Earth, transmitting signals that allow instant communication across continents. Airplanes carry people across oceans in hours that once took months to cross. The empire he built on horseback, that expanded through cavalry charges and siege weapons and the composite bow, now runs on silicon chips and nuclear power and satellite networks and technologies that would seem like magic to anyone from the 13th century. And yet, somehow, fundamentally, the challenges remain the same. How to maintain unity across vast distances and diverse populations. How to balance centralized authority with local autonomy. How to preserve order without crushing freedom. How to adapt to change while maintaining continuity. How to give people enough stake in the system that they support it rather than seeking to overthrow it. These are the same problems he grappled with 800 years ago, just with different tools and technologies and contexts. He has become more symbol than ruler at this point. A living embodiment of historical continuity, a connection to the past that makes the present seem less disconnected, less adrift. People make pilgrimages to Karakoram hoping to see him. Scholars from around the world request audiences to discuss history. Filmmakers want to document his existence and preserve his stories before what? Before he finally dies. But he has not died in over 900 years. There is no reason to think death will come now. He grants interviews occasionally, carefully controlled encounters where he speaks about the 13th century, about the unification of the Mongol tribes, about the campaigns across Central Asia and into China and Europe. And people listen, absolutely fascinated, because he is not recounting history he learned from books or chronicles. He is describing events he personally experienced, people he personally knew, battles he personally fought. He talks about riding with Jeeb and Subutai, about debating strategy with Subutai, about the feel of a bow in his hands and the sound of hoofbeats on the steppe. The past is not abstract for him, not distant. It is memory, vivid and immediate and painful and precious, as real as yesterday even though it was centuries ago. 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, crowds gathering on both sides to tear down the concrete barrier that divided the city for decades, and the world celebrates what seems like the triumph of freedom and democracy over totalitarianism. The Soviet Union, that great rival superpower of the 20th century, is collapsing, fragmenting, dissolving into its constituent republics after 70 years of existence. The Mongol Empire, which has evolved into something neither purely autocratic nor purely democratic over its centuries of existence, watches with interest and careful analysis. Genghis Khan has spent over 1,000 years learning to balance contradictions, learning to incorporate opposing principles into a single functioning system, unity and diversity, tradition and innovation, central authority and local autonomy, stability and change. And now, as the 20th century draws to a close, as the Cold War ends and a new world order begins to emerge, The empire faces fresh challenges that require yet another adaptation. Globalization accelerates at dizzying speed. Digital communication networks spread across the planet. The internet emerges, connecting billions of people in ways that would have been unimaginable even decades before. These technologies break down barriers faster than any Mongol army ever did. Information flows freely across borders that once were impermeable. People connect with others halfway around the world, sharing ideas and images and culture in real time. The old methods of control, of information management, of maintaining distinct regional identities within a larger imperial framework, they no longer work the same way in this new connected world. He is 1082 years old, a span of time so vast it defies human comprehension, and he must reinvent his empire once again. The Mongol Empire becomes increasingly federal in structure, more decentralized in practice. Regional governments gain greater autonomy, managing their own affairs with less interference from the center. The eternal Khan remains as a symbolic head of state, a unifying figure whose presence provides continuity and legitimacy. But real power shifts gradually to elected assemblies and appointed administrators, to councils and committees and bureaucracies that function according to established procedures rather than personal authority. It is a gradual process, not a sudden revolution but an evolution spanning decades, implemented through thousands of small changes and adjustments. And he allows it to happen, even encourages it in subtle ways, because he understands something fundamental. Immortality does not mean rigidity. To survive across centuries, one must change. To endure, one must evolve. Clinging to the past, trying to preserve things exactly as they were, is a path to irrelevance and eventual collapse. In his private moments, he walks through museums dedicated to his own life, vast institutions that preserve and display artifacts from every era of his impossibly long existence. Exhibits showing his armor from the Unification Wars, battered and worn from countless battles. Treaties he signed centuries ago, the ink faded but the seals still visible. Paintings depicting him at various stages, portraits commissioned across the centuries showing the same unchanging face. Sculptures, photographs from the 20th century. He is history walking through history, a living paradox, a man who should not exist but does, who has become his own museum exhibit while still living and breathing and making decisions that affect billions. 2001. The new millennium has begun with celebrations and hope and anticipation of a better future. But that optimism is shattered on September 11th when terrorist attacks kill thousands in New York and Washington, shocking the world and ushering in a new age of anxiety and security concerns. The age of globalization reveals its dark side in the most brutal way possible. Interconnection means that violence can spread as easily as ideas, that hatred can organize across borders as efficiently as commerce, that enemies can strike from anywhere without warning. Genghis Khan, who once built an empire through violence, who conquered cities and ordered massacres, who built pyramids of skulls as warnings to those who would resist his rule, who understands terror as a weapon because he wielded it himself centuries ago, now faces a different kind of conflict entirely. Not armies against armies in pitched battles, not state against state in conventional wars, but networks against states, ideologies against order, small groups of determined individuals leveraging technology and surprise to strike at targets they could never defeat through conventional force. The Mongol Empire, with its centuries of experience managing diverse populations and religions, with its long tradition of pragmatic tolerance and incorporation rather than forced conversion or cultural genocide, becomes in some ways a model for counterterrorism strategies that emphasize integration over exclusion, economic development over purely military action, addressing root causes rather than just symptoms. It is not perfect, of course. Nothing ever is. There are still attacks, still violence, still terrible suffering. Extremist groups still emerge, still recruit, still plan operations. But the empire survives, adapts its security measures, adjusts its policies, continues functioning despite the threats. He is 1,194 years old now, having lived through more than a millennium, and he has seen every form of human conflict imaginable. Tribal warfare on the steppes, dynastic struggles for succession, religious wars between competing faiths, nationalist uprisings against imperial rule, ideological battles between capitalism and communism, and now this terrorist networks operating across borders, fighting not for territory but for symbolic victories, seeking not conquest but disruption. And he has learned through all this accumulated experience that violence solves far less than it seems to in the moment, that conquest is infinitely easier than governance, that fear is a tool with severely diminishing returns over time. The young Temujin who watched his father die from Tartar poison, who swore revenge, who eventually slaughtered the Tartars systematically, killing every male taller than a cart wheel. That version of himself seems distant now, almost alien, someone he barely recognizes even though the memories remain perfectly clear. And yet, he remembers the rage that fueled him, the hunger for power and security that drove his conquests, the desperate need to prove himself and build something that could never be taken away. Those memories keep him grounded in some essential way, remind him of his origins, prevent him from becoming too detached, too inhuman, too far removed from the ordinary struggles and fears that drive human behavior. 2015. The world is now fully digital, transformed by technologies that connect and monitor and track everything. Social media platforms allow billions of people to share thoughts and images and opinions instantly with global audiences. Smartphones put more computing power in people's pockets than existed in entire research facilities when he first witnessed the computer age. Artificial intelligence begins to make decisions that affect people's lives in ways both subtle and profound. The Mongol Empire has adapted to this new reality, has established a presence in virtual spaces, has created systems and procedures for governing in an age where information moves faster than thought, where news and rumors and propaganda spread globally in seconds. Genghis Khan himself has learned to use these technologies, though he does so with the profound caution of someone who has seen too many revolutions, too many transformations that promised utopia and delivered chaos, to be swept up in uncritical enthusiasm about any new development. He gives his first live-streamed address to the world in 2016, and billions of people across the planet watch in real time as the Eternal Khan, 1,209 years old, speaks about continuity and change, about the lessons of history, about the challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. It is deeply surreal. A man born in 1262, a man who learned to ride horses before he could walk properly, who fought with bows and swords, who conquered an empire using tactics and technologies that would seem primitive to modern eyes, now speaking fluently about artificial intelligence and climate change and the future of civilization. And yet, he does it with genuine authority, with wisdom that comes from experience spanning centuries, from having witnessed transformation after transformation, revolution after revolution, from having learned how to adapt and survive and guide others through periods of disorienting change. The Mongol Empire is now one of several superpowers in a multipolar world. It competes economically and cooperates politically with the United States, the European Union, China, India, various regional powers. The old dream of a single unified world empire, of bringing all humanity under one system of law and governance, has long since faded into impossibility. The world is too complex now, too diverse, too dynamic, too interconnected in some ways and too fragmented in others for that kind of total unification. But the Mongol Empire remains, still vast, still influential, a confederation spanning Central Asia and parts of Eastern Europe and the Middle East and portions of South Asia. It is held together not by fear anymore, not by conquest or military dominance, but by institutions carefully built and refined over centuries, by shared history that spans generations, by economic integration that makes separation costly, by cultural connections that transcend political boundaries, and by the symbolic presence of a leader who has literally been there since the very beginning, who embodies continuity in a world that often feels like it is changing too fast to comprehend. He thinks about death sometimes during these years, wonders in his private moments if it will ever actually come. He has been waiting for it for over 1,000 years now, expecting it, assuming it must arrive eventually. Wonders if he is truly immortal in some absolute sense, or if he is simply living through an impossibly long delay, an inexplicable extension, and death waits somewhere ahead in the future, patient and inevitable, ready to finally claim him when whatever force has preserved him decides to release its hold. 2025. The world faces cascading crises that seem to threaten the very fabric of civilization. Climate change accelerates, bringing droughts and floods and storms of unprecedented intensity, forcing mass migrations and straining resources. Resource depletion creates competition and conflict. Political instability spreads across regions. Technological disruption transforms labor markets faster than societies can adapt. Artificial intelligence raises profound questions about the future of human work and purpose. Humanity stands at what feels like a crossroads, a pivotal moment where every decision seems to carry existential weight, where the choices made now could determine the trajectory of civilization for centuries to come. Genghis Khan, now 1,218 years old, having witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations and systems and ways of organizing human society, convenes an unprecedented global summit in Karakoram. Leaders from every nation on Earth are invited and attend. Scientists and activists and religious figures from every tradition. Representatives of indigenous communities whose voices have too often been ignored. Artificial intelligence researchers wrestling with the implications of their creations. Ethicists and economists and futurists and historians. They all gather in the ancient capital, which has been rebuilt and expanded and transformed countless times over the centuries, now a gleaming city that somehow blends traditional Mongol architectural elements with cutting-edge sustainable design. Solar panels and wind turbines integrated seamlessly with temples and palaces. And the eternal Khan, who has seen civilizations rise and fall, who has witnessed humanity's capacity for both extraordinary creation and terrible destruction, who has learned through bitter experience how easily things can collapse when societies stop working together, addresses them all. He speaks about the long view, about the patience and persistence required to build something truly lasting, about the dangers of short-term thinking and immediate gratification when facing challenges that span generations. He talks about the unification of the Mongol tribes in the 13th century, describing how it took decades of warfare and diplomacy and careful alliance building, how nothing happened quickly or easily, how the empire that eventually emerged was not built in a single lifetime, but across generations of sustained effort, except that he lived through all of it, witnessed every phase, learned every lesson personally. He proposes a comprehensive framework for global cooperation, not a world government that would erase national sovereignty and cultural diversity, but rather a system of interlocking agreements and institutions that can address planetary challenges while respecting local differences, that can coordinate action on climate and resources while allowing space for regional autonomy and cultural preservation. It is ambitious, perhaps impossible, the kind of proposal that in normal circumstances would be dismissed as impractical idealism. But coming from someone who has actually built and maintained an empire across 12 centuries, who speaks with the authority of unimaginable experience, it carries weight that no other leader could provide. The summit does not solve everything, of course. It would be absurd to expect any single conference to resolve problems that have been building for decades. But it creates genuine momentum, establishes new connections between leaders who might otherwise never meet, plants seeds of cooperation and understanding that may grow into solutions decades or even centuries from now. And Genghis Khan understands this better than anyone alive, that this is how real change happens, how lasting transformation occurs. Not through sudden revolutions or dramatic moments, but slowly, incrementally, across timescales that exceed normal human lifespans, through patient accumulation of small improvements and gradual shifts in understanding. Except that his lifespan is not normal. He has lived long enough to see the fruits of seeds planted centuries before. Long enough to understand how small changes compound over generations into fundamental transformations. 2038. Artificial intelligence has reached levels of sophistication that raise profound questions philosophers and ethicists are only beginning to grapple with seriously. Are these systems truly conscious in any meaningful sense? Do they experience something we could recognize as thought or feeling? Do they have rights that we must respect? How should humanity relate to intelligences we have created that may eventually surpass us in capability, that are genuinely other in ways that challenge our understanding? The Mongol Empire, with its extraordinarily long history of managing diversity and pluralism, of incorporating wildly different cultures and belief systems into a single functioning polity, takes a leading role in developing ethical frameworks for artificial intelligence governance. Genghis Khan himself meets regularly with AI researchers, philosophers, ethicists, computer scientists, having become deeply fascinated by these questions in ways he did not anticipate. He is 1,231 years old, having lived longer than seems possible, having become something other than fully human simply through the fact of continuing to exist across centuries, and he finds himself uniquely positioned to contribute to discussions about non-human intelligence, about consciousness that emerges from substrate different from biological brains. He speaks in these forums about adaptation, about the necessity and difficulty of learning to see the world from perspectives radically different from one's own. He talks about his early encounters with Chinese civilization, with its sophisticated bureaucracy and Confucian philosophy that seemed alien to a steppe warrior, about engaging with Islamic culture and its different conception of law and society, about absorbing European thought with its emphasis on individual rights and rationality. Each required him to expand his understanding profoundly, to recognize the validity and value of worldviews he was not born into, to incorporate foreign concepts without losing his own identity. Perhaps, he suggests in these discussions, humanity's relationship with artificial intelligence will follow a similar pattern. Initial fear and conflict born of misunderstanding, then gradual accommodation as both sides learn to communicate, then cooperation based on mutual benefit, then eventually integration, the creation of something genuinely new that incorporates both human and machine intelligence in ways we cannot currently imagine. Not replacement of humanity by machines, not subjugation of AI by humans, but synthesis, combination, collaboration. It is speculative, admittedly. No one knows how this will actually unfold. Not even someone who has lived for 12 centuries and witnessed countless technological and social revolutions. But he has learned through all that experience that the future is shaped significantly by how we choose to approach it, with fear or curiosity, with rigid defensiveness or flexible openness, with isolation or genuine engagement, with attempts to control or willingness to collaborate. And he chooses, as he has always ultimately chosen throughout his impossibly long life, to remain open, to adapt, to evolve, to engage with the new rather than clinging desperately to the familiar. 2056. Genghis Khan is 1,249 years old, an age so vast it has long since ceased to have any real meaning, and the world continues its relentless, accelerating transformation into forms that would be unrecognizable to any previous generation. Humanity has established permanent settlements on Mars, colonies that are beginning to be self-sustaining, that may eventually become independent societies with their own cultures and identities. Genetic engineering has eliminated most hereditary diseases that once caused terrible suffering, has extended healthy human lifespans, has opened possibilities for human enhancement that raise profound ethical questions. Quantum computers have revolutionized everything from medicine to materials science to climate modeling, processing information in ways that classical physics never permitted. Climate change, which threatened catastrophe in the early 21st century, has been at least partially stabilized through coordinated global efforts, through new technologies for carbon capture and renewable energy, through preservation of ecosystems and creation of new forms of sustainable agriculture. The challenges are not solved completely, may never be fully solved, but humanity has stepped back from the brink of environmental collapse. The Mongol Empire has changed yet again, has evolved into something that would be utterly unrecognizable to the Mongols of the 13th century who rode out from the steppes to conquer the known world. It is now a loose confederation, a network of autonomous regions united primarily by shared history, by common institutions that have proven their value over centuries, by economic integration that makes separation impractical, and by the symbolic presence of the eternal Khan. He rarely governs in any direct sense anymore. His role has become almost entirely ceremonial, advisory, symbolic. He attends important events when his presence carries weight. He gives speeches at universities and conferences about history and continuity and the long perspective. He writes essays that are widely read about change and adaptation, and what he has learned across 12 centuries of existence. He is a living monument, a breathing piece of history, a bridge between the deep past and the uncertain future. And he has finally, after more than 1,000 years of struggle and adaptation and evolution, found something like peace with his immortality. He no longer actively seeks death, no longer resents the unending continuation of his existence. He has found purpose in simply being, in bearing witness, in serving as a reminder that history is not some abstract force but was lived by real people with real hopes and fears and dreams and failures. That the past was not simple or inevitable but contingent and complex. On quiet evenings when his schedule permits, he still walks through the grasslands near Karakoram, grasslands that have changed far less than the cities, that still whisper with wind moving through grass much as they did when he was a boy learning to ride, when the world was simpler and smaller and he had no idea what lay ahead. He thinks about Bort often during these walks, his first wife who he loved with fierce devotion for the brief decades she lived, who has been dead now for over 1,000 years. About his sons who never achieved their full potential because they could never escape his shadow. About Jamuka and Subutai and Jeeb and all the companions of his youth, all gone so long ago their names are preserved only in histories he helped write. They are gone, all of them, have been gone for centuries upon centuries. But they are not forgotten. They live on in his memory, more vivid sometimes than the present, their voices and faces and spirits carried forward through time by his impossible continuation. The sun sets over the steppes, casting long shadows across the land, painting the sky in shades of orange and red and purple. And Genghis Khan, the eternal Khan, the man who unified scattered tribes and built an empire that spanned continents and somehow survived across 12 centuries, walks on slowly, his footsteps steady, into the twilight, into whatever future awaits, into time that seems to have no ending. The world continues to turn on its axis, day following night following day. History continues to unfold, new chapters being written by billions of people making billions of decisions. And somewhere in the vastness of Central Asia, beneath the same eternal sky that witnessed his birth over 1,200 years ago, beneath the same stars that guided nomads across the steppes for millennia before the Mongols and will shine for millennia after, he continues. Living, remembering everything, enduring when endurance seems impossible. The empire he built has outlived all others in human history, has survived not through rigid adherence to ancient ways but through constant adaptation, not through unchanging tradition but through perpetual evolution, not through conquest anymore, but through institutions that have proven their worth across centuries. And at its heart, a single continuous thread running through all those transformations, a life that should have ended in 1227 beside the Liupan Mountains, but somehow did not. A life that has stretched across centuries and ages and worlds that bear almost no resemblance to each other. He does not know if he will ever truly die. After more than 1,000 years of waiting, he has stopped trying to predict when or how it might happen. He does not know if there is an ending waiting somewhere ahead, or if this will simply continue forever, consciousness preserved impossibly across infinite time. But he knows, with the absolute certainty born of 1,000 years of direct experience, with wisdom earned through surviving every challenge history could throw at him, that he will face whatever comes with the same determination that carried him from an abandoned boy on the steps to the ruler of half the world. The story is not finished. It cannot be finished, because stories only end when the last person who remembers them dies, and he has not died. Because Genghis Khan still lives, still walks the earth, still carries forward everything that came before. And as long as he lives, as long as consciousness continues in this impossible form, the empire endures. Not frozen in amber as it was, not clinging desperately to the 13th century, but as it becomes, as it must become to survive, forever adapting to new circumstances, forever changing to meet new challenges, forever continuing forward into whatever future emerges. The wind moves through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and distance and growing things. Somewhere far off, a bird calls, its song echoing across the empty plain, answered by another in the gathering darkness. And in that darkness, the eternal Khan walks on, a single figure moving through the vast landscape that birthed him, walking into a future that seems to have no end, walking into time itself, walking into eternity that somehow,